one way of deciding whether you like the result in a particular case and whether you're happy with the implications of that result is to apply the decision in particular hypothetical situations. So what I want to do now is to suggest just 3 situations, and I want you to think about the application of the law of murder and possible defences and see whether you are happy with the result that you've reached. The first situation is based on a real example. A number of years ago, a ferry capsized and a lot of people drowned. But a lot of people survived and they needed rescuing. A rescuer got onto the side of the ship and put a rope ladder down, and some of the passengers managed to climb out. But one of the passengers got stuck on the ladder. Maybe he was very cold and very frightened, and he could neither move up nor down the ladder. And there were people down below in the water who needed rescuing, who were drowning. Somebody higher up the ladder saw what was happening and decided that after trying to coax the passenger who was stuck, that the only solution was to push that passenger off the ladder. And a number of people then climbed up and were rescued. Now let's assume that the person who was pushed off the ladder died. And let's also assume that 10 people were then able to be rescued. They climbed up the ladder and escaped. Could we say that the person who pushed the passenger off the ladder is guilty of murder? Well, if we think about this logically, the person who did the pushing has caused the death of the passenger. And whilst I think it's fair to assume he didn't want the passenger to die, it's probably fair to assume that he did foresee death, or at least serious injury, as a virtually certain consequence. So therefore, he has the necessary intention for murder. And if you cause death, and if you have that intention, you are guilty of murder, unless if you have a defence. Now, what might that defence be? We know from the 3 judgments in Re A that there are 2 possible defences. 2 of the judges really focused on necessity. Now, can you say that the defendant who pushed the passenger off the ladder was acting out of necessity? One argument in favour of that is that it's better that 1 person dies and that 10 survive. But are you happy with that? Does that mean that we're not valuing the life of the 1 person who dies and we're valuing the lives of the 10 other people more? And also it follows from this, do we actually want the rescuer to be punished? Should he be convicted of murder? Should the mandatory life sentence be imposed? Or maybe he should be convicted of murder and maybe a discretionary sentence is more appropriate. But there's one other solution. Lord Justice Ward in Re A talked about self-defence or acting to defend another person. Traditionally, that defence is only available where the person who dies is attacking or threatening to attack the defendant. Now in Re A, Lord Justice Ward said that the weaker twin could be regarded as passively attacking or threatening the life of the stronger twin. And so he talks about this notion of using force to get rid of that threat, the threat of attack. Now we could use that argument in this ferry disaster example. You might say that the person on the ladder is by his very existence threatening the existence of the other people, the people down below. And it's therefore important and appropriate for the other passenger, the defendant who did the pushing, to push that passenger off the ladder in order to save the other people. That involves an extension of a notion of acting to defend other people from attack. And if we accept that argument, it would mean that the defendant would not be guilty of murder at all, and would not be guilty of any crime at all. So that's one problem. Now think about the second problem. Imagine a case where two mountaineers are rock climbing. They're high up a mountain and they're tied together by a rope. One of them slips and he's hanging off that rope. He's dangling over a massive drop and he's not able to clamber up onto the rock himself. The other person is holding onto the rock face and he's holding tightly, but he knows that he cannot hold on for much longer. So what he does is he cuts the rope and the other person falls to his death. Is that murder? Well, the person who cuts the rope has caused the death of the other person, and he intended to do so again because he foresaw death as a virtually certain consequence. So this looks like murder. Again, we might want to say he has a defence based on maybe self-defence or using force to defend yourself against an attack. Or maybe we want to say he's acting simply for reasons of necessity. The person who was hanging from the rope was destined to die, and therefore it is appropriate to cut the rope to save one person's life rather than to have two die. Now, if you think about it, this case is very similar to the facts of Rie. Of course, it doesn't involve conjoined twins, but it does involve two mountaineers who are connected by a rope. The person hanging from the rope is destined to die, and therefore maybe, using the reasoning in Rie, it is appropriate to cut the rope. Finally, this example is based on a real case decided in the late 19th century called Dudley and Stevens. Simplifying it a little bit, imagine a case where there has been a shipwreck and there are three people who are survivors of that shipwreck and they are in a lifeboat. Let's say they have no food and no water, and they are in the high seas, miles away from anywhere, and there's no sign of any rescue ship. After a number of days without any food and without any water, they are not doing very well. And one of them in particular is really close to death. Imagine the other two decide that because they are slightly stronger, they will kill the weaker person and they will eat that person. And that's what they do. And this is actually what happened in Dudley and Stevens. Very soon after eating the dead person, they are rescued. Are they guilty of murder? Well, clearly they've caused death, and clearly they intended to do so. Now, you can't use this argument based on use of force because of being under an attack or a threatened attack. The weaker person who is eventually killed is not in any way attacking or threatening to attack the other two people. So the only possible argument is one based on necessity. Now here, do you think it is appropriate to have a defence of necessity? Is it appropriate to allow the two people who survive to decide that they are going to kill the weaker person, the person they at least think is weaker than them, in order for them to survive? Now, what is actually interesting about Dudley and Stevens is that the court considered whether the killers should have a defence of necessity, and they concluded that no defence should be available, and therefore the killers were convicted of murder. And at that particular time, they were liable to be executed. But what is particularly interesting about that case, even though they were convicted of murder, there was a public outcry, and Dudley and Stevens were soon released from prison and allowed to live their lives as normal. Now that raises some very interesting questions to think about. Do you think Dudley and Stevens should have a defence of necessity? Perhaps using some of the arguments in Re A, they should have such a defence. But if they shouldn't have such a defence, and they are convicted of murder, what about punishment? What is the point of punishing them? Perhaps you think they should go to prison for a period of time, but how long? And what's the point of sending them to prison? Now that raises some really big issues as what we're trying to do when we punish people. And one final way of thinking about a case such as Dudley and Stevens. Imagine that you are in that lifeboat. Imagine that you haven't had anything to eat or drink for a very long period of time, and there's no prospect, you think at least, of being rescued. What would you do? Would you kill one of the people in the lifeboat and eat them in order that you can survive? Or would you say that acting for the greater good requires you to sacrifice your own life? When you start thinking about cases such as Re A and Dudley and Stevens, and there are loads of other cases and examples raising the same sorts of points, you're forced to think about some very difficult and deep issues of law, ethics and morality. But it's always useful to put yourself in the position of a potential defendant and just ask yourself, what would you do in those circumstances?